Well, good evening, everybody. Go ahead and turn your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 17. 1 Samuel chapter 17. It's good to be here this evening. I do appreciate the opportunity to speak. Pastor is right. I've been here a while. This is probably the longest thing I've ever done in my life. So it's been good. Not always easy, but nothing of any value really is very easy. My wife's not here. She's actually picking up her family from the airport. They all went to Italy to visit the homeland, and so we've had some of their kids at our house, which hasn't been terrible. Seriously, because this is recorded, it has not been terrible, okay? So she's picking up the second half of the party this evening from the airport. So last year, I was asked to speak from Titus 2 on the topic of what it means to be grave, and like always, I had more material than time. I've always kind of been that sort of person. I was sort of disappointed in the message because I felt like while the material was biblical and good, I ran out of time before I got to much of the practical application, and so it's been on my heart ever since to kind of pick up where we left off. But if you don't recall that or you weren't here for that, don't worry. We're just going to kind of pick up where we left off. But a year ago, we finished off with the idea of David, who speaks about when he's facing Goliath. He talks about the fact that he killed a lion and a bear, and that the lion and the bear had taken some of his dad's sheep, and so he was saying how he felt like he could face Goliath because he had that. So let's start reading in verse number 32. Verse number 32. And it says, "And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of those, seeing he hath defiled the armies of the living God." And so we discussed in the last time how Goliath is coming for each and every one of us in one form or fashion or another, and nothing we do will keep Goliath at bay for long. We can only choose to be ready for him. Goliath will take different forms, he will be different for each of us, different battles that we all must face. And tonight's lesson is for everybody, and the truths will be applicable for all, regardless of your race, your gender, or your age. But many of the examples will focus on the young man, because I do believe that manhood is under attack in our nation today. We can see it when a man is considered brave to dress up and pretend to be a woman, compete in women's sports, invade women's locker rooms, and women are told they can do nothing but get in line and conform. As a man raising 3 daughters, I find this very concerning. While at the same time, in the month of June, all you hear about is Pride Month. And very few remember the 4,414 Allied servicemen killed on June 6, 1944, during the invasion of Normandy. That was 4,414 men who died on one day, in one 24-hour period. And in June, all we hear about is Pride Month. Let that sink in for a minute, about where we've got to as a nation. But when we think about these verses with David, we might make 2 mistakes when we read these. First of all, we might think that David thinks to himself, hey, God's going to deliver this Philistine into my hands. Maybe David just walks up and he thinks, I'm going to pray to God, and God's going to make this all work out easy for me. Well, the Bible actually gives us a little bit of some insight in that that's not what David thought. Look at verse number 40. It says that he took a staff in his hand and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag, which he had, even in a scrip, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. How do we know that David didn't think that it was going to be easy? Why did he take more than 1 stone? You see, the reality was that David thought he was going to win, that Goliath was going to deliver God was going to deliver Goliath into David's hand, but David thought it was going to be a fight. And David was prepared for a battle because when he had faced the lion and the bear, the Bible tells us that in verse number 35, when it says, I caught him by his beard and I smote him and slew him. I mean, imagine wrestling with a lion or a bear and you're talking about grabbing it by its beard. All right? The second mistake that we often make is we think that David walked up to Goliath full of stupid, youthful pride, but that's also not the case. David has had real victories in his life to look back on in the form of the lion and the bear. He's not just some arrogant young punk who never accomplished anything. And so, all of us must face this reality and look back at our lives, and young people must look at their own lives and say, when Goliath comes for you, what victories will you have in your life that you can say, I can face this Goliath because I've already faced and defeated these things? In what way has your life up to this point prepared you to face that Goliath? But not only that, we're going to look at something that works against us. It's something inside each and every one of us. It's something that we all deal with. We're born with it. It's part of our human nature, and we can't avoid it. And it tries desperately to keep us from fighting our lion and our bear and our Goliath. And even worse, it tries to convince us to tear down and attack anyone else who tries to stand up and fight Goliath in their lives. Keep your hand there in 1 Samuel, but go to Jeremiah chapter 17. Jeremiah chapter 17. I've thought a lot on these verses over this past couple years because if you know much about anything that's happened in my personal life, my family's kind of gone through some struggles. They're not my struggles particularly, but they have affected my family to some degree. And what I've seen is, both in my workplace and my personal life and my family life and things like that, I kind of saw this theme coming about of what I would consider to be people who sort of lied to themselves. And I got to thinking, though, well, at a certain point I wondered, God, what am I lying to myself about? Jeremiah 17:9 tells us the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? What a complete verse, right? I mean, you notice the Bible doesn't give any wiggle room there. It's like saying, hey, listen, anything that comes out of this thing, it's all bad. It's all bad. The Bible doesn't say some's bad, some's good. No, it says it's all bad. Think about it. There aren't a whole lot of verses like this, but here's a couple. Isaiah 64:6. We are all as an unclean thing, and all our righteousnesses are as filthy rags, and we all do fade as a leaf, and our iniquities like the wind have taken us away. It's pretty complete, isn't it? Not a lot of wiggle room. Romans 7:18. For I know that in me, in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. Isn't that interesting? How complete the Bible is. It says your heart, your flesh, all bad. Don't trust it, all bad. Verses like these, they don't leave much in the way of debate on where Scripture stands regarding things like our works. But going back to Jeremiah 17, the Bible doesn't tell us much in the way of how. Like, how is the heart deceitful? In what ways does it lie and trick me? And how can I know when it's telling the truth? We're going to look at a story there with David, and we'll see a prime example of a man who acted upon the lies of his own heart in the situation with David. Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 17. I'm going to maybe spoil the ending, but I'll tell you this. Our heart seeks to do one thing for us. And if you take nothing else from this lesson, take this. It is that our heart continually tries to paint truths for us that are more palatable for us to take than the reality. And I say truths there as in sarcasm, lies. Our heart lies to us by painting a picture of reality that is not accurate, but it makes us feel better about ourselves. Look at verse 28 in this story. We're going to see how Eliab, David's brother, acts out on some lies in Eliab's heart. See here in verse 28, it says, And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. Now, how do we know that there's some lies here? Well, if we won't take the time to turn there, but if we go back just one chapter, we would see that Eliab comes forward first, and he's presented first to Samuel. And then Eliab is skipped over. for his youngest brother, David. And so we might say, if we were to meditate on this and think about what might Eliab be facing in his heart in this moment, one emotion might come to mind. What might that emotion be? Envy, jealousy. Maybe Eliab is just a little bit jealous of David because Eliab is this close to being king, and then it all gets taken away from him. Maybe. But there's a second thing that's pretty obvious here, another emotion that Eliab is probably faced with, fear. I mean, everybody there was terrified of fighting Goliath. Ironically, except for David, the young man, and the one who probably there was the least equipped to do it. And so we see two things that Eliab was probably, the Bible tells us pretty clearly, Eliab is struggling with: jealousy and fear. And does Eliab say to David, hey, David, listen, I'm kind of jealous that you're king. And maybe if you do this thing, this is going to start the beginning of your kingship. And so, but I'm also afraid, David. Does he say any of that? No. What does Eliab do to David? He does two things. First, he questions David's motives, and he says, oh, I know the naughtiness of thine heart. I know why you're here. And the second thing he does is he belittles David. With whom have you left those few sheep? Right? I'm here huddling in a corner, but I'm here in the military doing my thing, and you were just left to take care of these sheep. You're such a nobody, David, right? Because David's going to step out and try to do something. Eliab's heart is lying to Eliab. It is telling him something that is not true, and Eliab is acting upon it, and it comes out in what emotion? Anger. The Bible tells us that. Eliab's anger was kindled against David. I would also venture, and we don't have time to go into this, but I think this is something that is very applicable to men. We think it's manly to be angry, and we forget that probably it's because we're bothered about something else. What we do is we say, well, that guy ticked me off, not that guy might have hurt my feelings. No, we can't say that, so we just say, oh, I'm angry at that guy, right? And that's how we're dishonest with ourselves about our anger. And so our heart feeds us lies that are more palatable and easier for us to digest than the truth. And so we take in a mutilated view of the world that helps us to justify our own behavior, our own actions, our own choices, or our own inaction. Eliab was justifying his own inaction by condemning David's action. And that was the lie that came out of Eliab's heart that directed his actions in his life. Tonight we're going to see how Eliab speaks out to us to convince us to see the world not how it is, but rather how we want the world to be, so it makes us feel better about who we are. Because when we feel better about who we are so much more comfortable about not changing. You see, David had two things that he had defeated before in his life that made him think, maybe I can enter the ring with Goliath, and Goliath may not take me. He had two things. And so despite what the world tells us today, it's not a bad thing for a young person to build some successes in life. Not for the sake of becoming proud or arrogant, but because when the challenges in life come, you need to know you have some strength within you, with God's help that you can rely upon. You are not worthless. Which is why the title of tonight's message is, Young Person, You Need a Win. Because I'm afraid our world today has done just about everything in its power to take away a young person's ability to have good, positive wins in their life. And when that young person faces Goliath, they will have no lions and no bears that they've defeated to look back at. And so what will you have to fall back on? You'll only have two things to fall back on: youthful arrogance or cowardice. Is that what you want? Now, I do believe this is what the world wants. I do, especially when we think about manhood and masculinity. I believe it's what the world wants, because when men behave like fools, the portion of the world who hates masculinity get to say, see, I told you so. And so they want young men who behave like fools. Yes, they do. And the world that is afraid of men prefer good men be cowards. But when you've created cowards of all the good men, who will have stood up to the bullies and the tyrants, and what will you be left with? a world of Goliaths with no one left to fight them. Is that what you want? So let's start with a lion that we can slay in our own lives and that a young man or a young woman can slay in their lives. You can leave 1 Samuel, go to 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse number 3. It says, "Thou therefore endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ." Hardness. Now, hardness is just a word for hardships or trials or something along those lines. We might call it grit. We might call it toughness, something like that. And so I would ask you, what hardships are you able to endure? Consider just the life of David. Consider just what life was like when you were David back then, all right? And just compare it to our lives today. I mean, think about it, right? It's laughable, right? It's laughable to think that I, as a man, I'm 43 years old. It's laughable to think that I would compare myself to David at 16. I am a wimp compared to David at 16. Think about what David's life was like, right? Here's just one thing. Consider what it's like to live life where 80% of the time the temperature is uncomfortable. It's either too cold or it's too hot, almost all the time. There is zero temperature control in your life. The best you could do is start a fire in your house to not die of freezing at night. It's not so you'd be comfortable, it's just so you don't die. I encountered this briefly when I was in this, I went on this big game hunting trip out in Montana. We were about 9,000 feet above sea level up in the mountains, staying in a tent. They called it a walled tent, but all tents have walls. And so this was not any better than that. And it had a little wood stove. And they told us, pack a sleeping bag and one that's rated for as cold as possible. And they were not kidding. It gets very cold in the mountains at night. And so you had a little wood stove. Spoiler alert, here's what happens at night. You have to get up, all right, in your skivvies, go out, get some wood, put it in the stove, get the fire going. And then for about 2 hours, it's so hot in the tent that you got to kick everything off. Then for about 15 minutes, the temperature is amazing. Then for 2 hours, you're curled into your sleeping bag like a tick, trying not to get out just so you can get a little bit of sleep. It's miserable. You do not get much sleep. The good news is we were all so tired from riding horses and hiking through the mountains at 9,000 feet, we still slept pretty good because we were just completely exhausted. You see, we don't even understand what it's like to live like that. To live in a day and age when a simple ear infection could leave you deaf, or worse, screaming in agony while a fever slowly killed you because there were no antibiotics. We don't often think about what it's like to be David, Gideon, Samson, Joshua, or any of the others who did great things and won incredible battles. These were men who knew what it was like to take another man's life in hand-to-hand combat. And we think, maybe they probably got wounded, right? So they had broken bones that were set with no anesthesia. They had stitches done with no anesthesia. I had a small procedure on my back done this year, and the guy did not put the thing in the right spot. And so about halfway through, I got to the place where the stitches were outside of the anesthesia. It was a rather uncomfortable experience. And they said, well, do you want to stop? And I'm like, why stop now? Let's just keep going, right? You know, but just imagine you come back from battle and the doctor's whole job is to stick a stick in your mouth and say, bite down on this so you don't bite your tongue off. And we think to ourselves, yeah, I'm as tough as David. Laughable. To sleep on a floor because beds weren't there, right? Your blankets were made of like animal skins and furs. You ever slept with a real wool blanket? Yeah, it's like sleeping on an SOS pad. It's not at all like a microfiber blanket you'd pick up from Costco. There was no fridge to get food. You want food, you prepared a meal. You needed bread. You're thirsty, you went to the well to draw water. Or what was more likely, you didn't have water. You lived thirsty, right? Do you have any idea of this? I mean, it's amazing to think about it, just how different David's life was. Consider David's job as a young man working with animals, tending sheep, to be outside all day long, right? Maybe lucky if you had shade. I mean, like that's it. That's the high point of your day, when the sheep managed to walk someplace where you could hide under a tree for a little while. The rest of the time, you're either shivering because it's winter or you're sweating like crazy because it's summer. Then we think to ourselves, oh yeah, I'm as tough as David. It's laughable, right? You don't have to turn there, but Jeremiah 12:5 says, if thou hast run with the footmen, and they have wearied thee, then how canst thou contend with horses? And if in the land of peace wherein thou trustest, then they wearied thee, then how wilt thou do in the swelling of Jordan? We are as strong as the obstacles that we have faced in our life. And the reality is, David faced way more obstacles at 16 than I have ever at 43. Think about that. I'm telling you that very openly, right? Go to 1 Corinthians 9, verse number 25. It says, and every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible. I therefore so run, not as uncertainly, so fight I, not as one that beateth the air. But here it is. But I keep under my body, and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. What is the point here? The point is that Paul is reminding us to bring our flesh into submission. It is very much like wrestling with something on a daily basis and making it do what you want it to do. So I ask you this, young man, how has your life equipped you, like David's life equipped him, to face Goliath? If Goliath walked in here and started blaspheming the name of the Lord, would you enter the ring with him and defeat him with your mad Fortnite skills and your grit born of a lifetime of adverse conditions? Probably not. So what's a young man to do? Well, the answer is pretty simple. You must seek out hardships in your life. You must actively find things to do that are challenging. Because I've come to realize that life very much, like we as human beings, we've got really good at making life easy, especially the last 200 years, right? Life is very much, for generations, it's like that ridiculous Olympic sport, curling. The next generation is that fat puck that guy rolls out there. And then the other generations are going ahead with that ridiculous little broom, and they're trying their best to take all the obstacles away. Parents do this all the time with their kids. Oh, my fat little puck is making its way down the ice. I got to get all the obstacles out of the way because fat little puck might not be able to survive that little grain of ice. What happens when mom and dad is no longer there with the broom? Man, that little puck has no idea what to do. And this is how you raise a generation of kids that are anxious, that are depressed, that are suicidal, because they are completely ill-equipped for the challenges of the real world. Because everybody has rushed ahead of them with their ridiculous little brooms and brushed everything out and saying, hey, listen, try not to die. Just try not to die. I've read several books by Navy SEALs, and one of the things I often hear mentioned over and over again when they talk about BUDS training is many of them will say this expression when they go to the doctor would say, are you hurt or are you injured? Most parents spend all their time trying to make sure their kids don't get hurt, and really you should try to spend all your time just making sure your kid doesn't get injured. It's two different things. You can take a walk and come back with muscle strains and you hurt. You are not injured. Fall out of a tree, break your arm, you're injured, right? A kid's climbing on the furniture, probably not going to hurt, not really going to injure themselves. Crawling on the furniture with a butcher knife, bad idea. Probably should put a stop to that. Crawling on the roof, that's a good recipe for injuring yourself. You see? Bringing our flesh into submission is this idea that we say, it is to stand when you want to sit. It is to walk when you want to ride. It is to run when you want to walk. It is to carry a burden when you want to leave it sitting there. It is to work when you want to be lazy. It is to risk when you want to play it safe. It is to strive when you want to relax. But conversely, it's also to restrain yourself. It is to restrain your body from doing the things it wants to do that aren't in your best interests. It is to be quiet when you want to shoot your mouth off. It is to shut down that inappropriate picture that came up on your social media feed when you want to see more. It's to not eat that second slice of pizza, even though you could. And so, I want to talk about some practical ways that you can test your flesh and you can see how much power your flesh has over you. Okay? These are practical ways. They do not involve sin, though. Okay? So it's actually a way you can tempt yourself, but it doesn't involve sin. So we're not talking about things like pornography, alcohol, drugs, nothing like that, okay? It's all very G-rated. But not only can I tell you in this, I'm going to tell you exactly what you're going to face. I'm also going to tell you how Eliab will speak to you through your heart, and we'll see how this goes, okay? You ready? Here it is, 2 words. Cold showers. Cold showers. That's a temptation you can set up for yourself. And if you fail, no sin involved. What do I mean by that? You take a cold shower with no hot water when hot water is available to you. This is something that I did just because I wanted to prove it myself. I wanted to prove it to myself. When I was on that mountain, middle of the week, all the guys there, they were taking baths with baby wipes. And I was like, nope, I got my bar of Irish Spring. I'm walking to the stream. Yep, I climbed in the stream. I put my coveralls down in a giant snow pile. On top of that, I had my 9mm handgun because there were timber wolves howling all over the place. It was amazing, and I was super awake. Did you know that studies suggest that a cold shower has enormous benefits? It's been linked with the same endorphin release as cocaine. Think about that. It's like doing cocaine without ruining your life. I mean, it's amazing. It's been linked with helping to fight off depression, anxiety, stress. It improves blood flow and muscle strain and recovery. If you do it, if you try it, I can almost guarantee Eliab will come and speak to you. He's going to say things like, well, that's silly. I can see it on some of your faces. Eliab's talking to you right now. You're looking at me like, cold showers. That's dumb. Never heard of such a thing, right? Okay. Now see, this is why I picked something that was very clearly not biblical, not unbiblical. It's not what I said, not biblical. Because nobody could say, if you don't take cold showers, you're not a good Christian. Can't say that. I can't say that. What I can say, though, is that if you're up to the challenge, you could say to yourself, 5 days this week, every morning, I'm going to take a cold shower. And you know what's going to happen? I can tell you this because I do it all the time. Eliab comes shouting in your head, this is insane, right? Absolutely. Here's a couple things you're going to learn about your flesh because you do this and your flesh will come out in your head in ways that you did not realize. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to learn some things. You're going to learn it never gets any easier to force yourself to do what you don't want to do. And you're never going to want to take a cold shower. I've taken hundreds of them. And every time I have to act in my mind, I picture my brain grabbing my flesh by the scruff of the neck and throwing it in the shower and saying, we're doing this because it's miserable. Then you get in there and you think, I'm dying. And it's not even that bad. The water's like 50. It's not even that bad. It's a fight to get into cold water when there's warm water available. It's a fight to stay under cold water. Because you know what else is going to happen? Eliab's going to tell you to do like this. You're going to press yourself up against the shower where most of the water is going down the drain. You get a little splatter on yourself and say, I took a cold shower, buddy. Yes, I did. Here's some things that Eliab's going to tell you through your deceitful heart. He will tell you it's way worse than it is. He'll have you believing it's not just mildly cold water, but rather it's breath-stealing razor blades that are slowly killing you. He will try to convince you to break your word to yourself, to free you of your commitment. If you say you'll stay under for a count of 60, 2 seconds in, you'll be like, 60 is insane. But you're not going to tell yourself, I'm going to quit. No, you're just saying 60 is silly. I've done it for 2 seconds, so I'm going to say 10 seconds, right? Because if I did it for 2 seconds, obviously I can do it for 60. I mean, I shouldn't have to do it for 60, but, right, that's what Eliab's going to say to you. I'm sure I'm not the only person who's ever experienced this kind of stuff. He's not going to tell you to quit outright. Instead, he's going to tell you to set your goal from 60 down to 10, then to 2. He'll tell you that no one's going to know if you just stand in the corner and barely let any water touch you. He'll tell you that no one will know if you quit. He'll tell you that it's silly, it's pointless, and there's no need to do this torture. But here's what he won't tell you. You don't have a strong enough will to do it. That's what he won't tell you. Just like he didn't tell Eliab, you're a coward. Eliab's heart didn't tell him that. Instead, Eliab's heart said, condemn David for trying to do something. You see, I'm not telling you you have to do this or that it's somehow linked to your spirituality. I'm not telling you that at all. I'm telling you, though, that Eliab is going to tell you things that are easier for you to bear. And doing something like that, I promise you, those things are going to come out in your head. I promise you they will. Because the truth is your flesh desires one thing above all else, and that is comfort. Even when you have to trade the strength of your will for that comfort, your heart will take that. Your heart will take you being a weaker person for the sake of comfort. Anyone who's ever tried to run a marathon or do anything of any significant exercise or value will know this. It doesn't have to be a cold shower. There are many other ways that you can push yourself and build grit and determination in your life other than a cold shower. One of the things that I often think about in my own life, I was with my stepmom. She used to board horses, and I have to kind of be careful here because, so we get a call one night that a horse was going into labor. It was going to give birth to a foal, and so we go out there. It's like the middle of the night, and I was with her because my dad was out drunk somewhere, and she couldn't leave me at the house, so we went to the barn, and the vet couldn't be contacted. And I had long, skinny arms. And they handed me a pair of gloves. And and this is where, again, because of our modern sensibilities, I can't go, but I'll just say the gloves went to my cheek. And so for 2 hours, I struggled to do what you do when you foal a horse. Teaches you some hardness, especially when the horse and the foal die. Teaches you some hardness. We're so far removed from things in our life that really push and, really struggle against our heart. I often think about Brother Carey. He's a man I love deeply. We would, I genuinely am saddened that most young people never got the chance to bale hay with Brother Carey. I mean, Brother Carey could go and he could work outside in the sun all day long. And then we'd go there, and we'd be 20, 30 years younger than him. And him and my father-in-law, Mike, and my grandfather, Gene, or my wife's grandfather, Gene, they could pick up these 80-pound bales of hay and just throw them one-handed. It was amazing as a young man to look at these guys just work like absolute machines. And what I realized is they had grown up in an era that had made them so much stronger than me. And so in a real way, we could honestly say that while our young people today might think, hey, I'm smarter than any other generation before me, and I've got so much more technology, in a very real way, our generations today are the weakest generations that this country has ever produced. And the only solution to that is to seek out hardship. So we've talked about the lion that we can slay. Now we're going to talk in closing about the bear that we can slay. Go to Joshua chapter 1. Joshua chapter 1. I tell these stories about Brother Carey because, a lot of people didn't get to know him very well as a person. You just knew him as a guy at church or whatever. But Brother Carey would, him and my father-in-law Mike, they'd call us up and say, hey, we got to ban some steers. Again, I have to be careful because modern sensibilities and all that. So if you know what that means, great. If you don't, you'll have to figure it out later. But Brother Carey and Mike, they liked to let the steers grow a little bit. And they thought it was great fun to do so because their boys would then have to go and wrestle these steers. And so I won't say what, but these steers do not want to be banded. I don't know if they know what's going on, but they fight you pretty good about it. And so me and my brother-in-laws, we'd get in there and we'd have to tackle these things to the ground. And these things would kick you. And I mean, you'd think, oh, it's a baby calf. It's so cute. Oh, man, they could kick you so hard, bust you. I mean, we'd get our lips busted, right? And Carrie and Mike would be along the fence with their boots, and they would be laughing at us as we wrestle these calves to the ground. And then once we got them all to the ground, then they'd come in and they'd do the banding. And then you'd have to let it up and you'd have to get out of there quick, right? Because this thing comes up fighting, right? And then when you're done, you're covered in cuts and bruises and scrapes and everything else because the thing will have pushed you up against barbed wire fences and all this. But you get this sense that these older guys liked trying your strength against these things. And you got stronger as a result, or you got your teeth knocked out sometimes. Joshua chapter 1, verse number 6, it says, "Be strong and of good courage, for unto this people shalt thou divide for an inheritance the land which I swear unto them, unto their fathers, to give them." Verse number 9 says some of the same things. While good courage is something for all of us, I am going to focus a little bit on young men here. And the lessons and the truths of this are applicable to everybody. But I see, I'm afraid that most young men now have been taught to avoid failure, to avoid trying, to avoid risk, to avoid getting hurt. I see many young men today afraid to do anything for fear they might be wrong, might be made fun of, might be rejected. And so they shrink in on themselves, never risking, never trying. And they've only ever been encouraged by well-meaning parents who have given them everything and not encouraged them to risk or to try or to work or to strive. Young men have such fragile egos, they can't bear the thought of something as simple as a public game for fear that they might make themselves look silly. This is something I see a lot at Backyard Bible Club, like Pastor Wally talks about. I've done it for forever. I've had the opportunity to work with some great young men. I worked with the Lakes boys and the Featherland boys are two sets of boys that I often think of in this. They're great young men. I think about, like, I would look and I'd see them up there during singing and stuff, embarrassing themselves. And I bet that if the prom king or prom queen would drive by, they would look and say, look at those boys. Look at those boys from high school over there. They're so stupid. But I bet if God looked down at that moment, he'd say, yep, proud of that. Yep, that's good stuff right there. But you know what else I worked with? A lot of young men who thought Backyard Bible Club was just an opportunity to preen themselves. Like some kind of bird, like, oh, is my hat on straight? Is my hair good? Oh. They couldn't possibly be bothered to actually participate in games or set a good example. In fact, they would actually actively try to distract other young people. And I'm talking church kids. I'm not talking about neighborhood kids. I'm talking about church kids. Why? Because it's not good courage. It's fear. It's only fear that causes you to do that. It's cowardice. That's what that is. You know, I've seen this a lot. You know, I do games for kids and stuff like that, and I got to say, I've heard it all before. I know Josh deals with this. I'm sure Joe dealt with this. I'm sure Pastor Wally dealt with this. You try to do games for kids. You know, some games work, some games don't, right? But I've heard it all before. The games were stupid. I wasn't interested. I'm too old for that sort of thing. I didn't find it enjoyable. Eliab is telling the young person in their heart, you're too cool for this, right? Not that you're afraid of embarrassing yourself. That's not it. No. And my all-time favorite is the other one. I didn't really try. Oh, cool. Because my Bible says in Colossians 3:23, whatsoever you do, do it heartily as unto the Lord and not unto men. It doesn't matter if you're digging a trench, working at McDonald's, playing a video game, or playing a game in youth group before the message. Good courage is to try. When you lose, it's good to learn to shrug it off and laugh at yourself. To do otherwise is to cultivate a weak and fragile ego. I'm going to close with this because I'm about out of time, but there's a practical way in which I encourage young men to develop some good courage in their life. Get a couple of friends together, some other guy friends together. Go to a public place, Kings Island, sporting event, places where people hang out. I don't know. I'm old. I don't know where these places are, but I assume you know. Go to a public place. Here it is. It's real simple. Walk up to a girl and ask her for her phone number. That's it. Try, fail, get embarrassed, try again. It's pretty simple. I'm not telling you to date outside your faith. Call her. If it ain't right, say, nah, no thanks. Hang up, right? The objective is you try something. But our world today is all about hiding. Hiding behind text, hiding behind social media, hiding behind this, hiding behind that. And young men are never taught to risk anything. Risk it. This is one of the things that you can do that'll help you to also identify the courage level of your friends. Because let's say I'm going to pick Max because Max is a family friend and he can take it. Let's say I'm out someplace with Max. I don't go to Kings Island because I'm old, as I said. But let's say I'm at Kings Island with Max. And Max says, hey, there's a girl over there. I think I'm going to ask her for her phone number. I say, cool, go ahead. So he goes over and he asks her for her phone number and she goes, right? And he comes back over to me and, all right, so I'm Max's friend. What do I do? Those in my Sunday school class know. I laugh at Max because I'm a guy. That's neither cowardice nor courage. It's just being a guy. If I do something dumb in front of Joe and he does not laugh at me, I'm offended, right? I mean, that's part of what being a guy is. But here's how you can identify if your friends are courageous or cowardly. If your friend says, well, that was dumb, you shouldn't have done that, that's a cowardly friend. If your friend says, boy, she shot you down, try again. There's another one. There's another one. There's another one. If I'm going door knocking with Joe and somebody throws us off the door, we can say, ooh, that did not go well. What are we going to do? Quit? Or just go to try another one, right? Listen, good courage is the sort of thing that is required in just about everything you need to do in life. And if you can't do something as simple as just ask a girl for her phone number, how are you ever going to open a business, write a book, run a ministry, or just teach a class, or just be faithful, or, I mean, think about it. You ever think, what are some things you might actually face as an adult in life? You may face a time in which, what we talked about earlier, when somebody comes and says, this boy wants to dress up as a girl and go into your daughter's locker room, and your school is going to tell you that is virtue. Are you going to have the courage to stand up? It's a fair question. Do you ever think about what it takes to preach and teach a lesson? How every single time a person stands in this pulpit, they risk censure, saying something embarrassing, saying something wrong, slipping up, offending somebody, hurting somebody's feelings. Nothing in life is done without good courage. And there are things you can do to push yourself to try to have some good courage in life. And that is a lion and a bear that each and every one of us can slay in our lives before we get to Goliath. Pastor Wally.